So, I'm here to talk about as sort of working inside government, but more actually, I guess, governments are large organizations. Everyone sort of thinks they're probably a bit broken, and they're slow. And ultimately, we've been able to do a lot of things, and if we can do them, so can anyone else. So, first, well, who am I? I'm a technical architect at the Government Digital Service, which is sort of a new unit of the UK Cabinet Office, basically tasked with all things internet-y. I'm Gareth R, basically on the internet everywhere. And I am a civil servant. I work for the government. I'm not contracting there. I'm not freelancing. I'm a civil servant. I work for a public body. But I have code on GitHub. And a good interview question that I started throwing into slides was, I was like, what's the last code you wrote? And the last code I wrote was actually to make Nginx validate JSON in and out in Lua, which was weird. But I run Vega Boxers. I run a DevOps Weekly newsletter. And I work for what is basically a startup in government. And I'll tell you sort of the background about how we got there and what we've done for this audience. So this lady, if you ever meet her, she's amazing. This is Martha Lane Fox. She's now Baroness Lane Fox. She wrote a report, as many good things start off with. Basically, someone wrote something down. But actually, this is a great document. It's short, succinct, and basically said to the UK government, you have a problem on the internet. And it called for a bunch of things. One was, you can't get yourself out of this problem. You need to come up with something new. This requires a revolution. Create a body of people and give them the power to fix it. It said, go into fixing content. The content for the UK government at the time, and governments everywhere for the most part, is scattered all over the place. Sort that out. The other thing was fix transactional services, so fix how government interacts with its people, and then try and get that information into people's hands. That report triggered a bunch of things, and one of them was an alpha. This was a concept car. This was a prototype. This was just imagine a world where there was a single government website. And this got a lot of people excited. And this is the bit where I joined. So I didn't work on that. I joined because from the back of that project, we got permission to do it for real. And at the start of 2012, we launched a beta. This was real. This was staffed. This was manned. This was changing every day. This was a website. This was a single website for government. But it did not, at this point, replace anything else. We were still proving that our ideas worked. And around about the same time, we got a name. We became a real thing. Before that, we were sort of a collection of people doing some stuff. And we were the Government Digital Service. And we had a relatively short period of time to ship a real thing. And in October last year, we closed down a large swathe of the government on the internet in the UK, and we replaced it. And we did that in one day, which was interesting. A lot of its content and a lot of its tools. So up to that point, and lots of government sites, and lots of large organization sites, and lots of sites, frankly, everywhere, it's just all content. It's like, well, what's the answer to this complex problem? It'll be a 50-page PDF document. We were able to take a bunch of those and turn them into actual tools that people could use. And it wasn't just tools for actually citizens, people who were needing that content. We built tools for people internally to use as well. And for the people who'd been managing the content previously or trying to do things inside government, just the idea that the person next to them could build tools just blew their minds. And we won awards, which was nice. And by this point, sort of now, today, we're an organization of about 250 people, running GovUK and doing a whole host of other things. And one of the things we're getting onto now is really taking a lot of the things we've learned, in that context, and working inside a large organization, and helping 25 other projects across the entire UK public sector, which is, well, the central government is about 400,000 people. So we're 250 sounds, oh, that's a good size. There's 400,000 other people that we're part of the sort of same body There's 25 projects, and we're taking what we've learned to them. So that's the sort of background. What I want to sort of talk about is some specific sort of examples that I think are interesting, that have sort of cropped up over that sort of year or so. Some of its observations about adopting agile in a large organization. How do we do it? What did we do? Specifically, how did we end up structuring ourselves? What did we do right? What did we do wrong? One of the other things is just the absolute criticality of basically being able to release software quickly, both in terms of like the ability and the agility it gives like an organization, a business, to do what it's there to do, but also just actually, it's often the one thing that basically, if you go in and you change if you get control of the change control process, you will have to solve all of the problems, all the process problems, all the people problems, all the organization problems. But if you get ownership of that one thing, you can probably drive like change everywhere else. I work for government. I work for a large organization. There are rules, and there are in a lot of sort of there's an accreditation process. We've got auditors. Anyone working in sort of financial services will know the same things. A bunch of the things people were like, well, you'll never be able to do X or Y or whatever it was that we were not allowed to do because the auditors won't let you. And actually, when we've been able to talk to them and show them what's possible, they're like, can I have that tomorrow? And how being very, very open about how we've done, what we're doing, when we've succeeded, when we've failed, what's worked, what hasn't, has helped us in a whole bunch of ways. And I think some of that's nearly easier in a government organization because my salary is paid for by the people I'm giving that information back to, the UK taxpayers. Whereas a commercial organization, it's a bit more different. But I think a lot of the benefits that we had out of that would have actually monetary value. So, working in an agile manner. As I said, we started small. We started very small. But one of the things we did right up front was basically put down what were the principles that we wanted our organization to work around. And we publish these on the internet because we tend to publish everything on the internet. But these were very straightforward, sort of just lines in the sand. And the first one, and that still drives everything we do, is basically start with needs. Start with what is the essence? What is the problem that you're trying to solve? Governments are large; they're solving lots of problems, but actually, you have to break that down. And it's important that it's the needs of someone who's the consumer, not the needs of the organization. And that, I think, sort of is nearly obvious. But actually, if you're inside a large organization that's been there a long time, nearly all the requirements will be driven by the business, this sort of like mythical non-entity, rather than, well, what's the consumer wanting here? And things that do the hard work to make it simple, do less. Like just trying to sort of basically just put a very sort of nearly abstract sort of line in the sand about how we were going to go about things. So the example I'll talk about in terms of the team here is the Gov.uk website that we launched. So this was, as I say, from one team of about 14 people. That looked something like this. Ultimately, there was a product owner, there was a delivery manager, there were a bunch of developers, designers, content people. And it was basically just a very much sort of, there was just a group of us and we were doing some stuff. But we grew that throughout that project's program of works lifestyle to about 140 people in 14 teams. And obviously that was breaking things down, and when and how to break down the teams in the fact that this happened in about a year. So actually that was someone joining, like several people joining every week. It was and new teams having to be formed and getting that wrong. And my sort of area of that was really around sort of web operations and was in the sort of DevOps track, I guess. And how we approached that was basically the web operations team was just another product team. It was just another one of these units that with people of a specific skill set. And it had a product owner and it had a delivery manager. It was just another part. It wasn't special in any way. But we also had web operations people or people with that sort of skill set in other teams where they're required. And sometimes that was a short-term thing, and sometimes it was that team required something over a period of time. So we had the skills distributed across the organization, not all just sort of siloed away, not separate from the rest of the program of work, not separate from the developers, not separate from the sort of designers. Everyone was mixed up. And we also had developers working on operations tasks. It wasn't, oh, that's just for those people. It was understood that we all lived and all died together, not like sort of siloing off bits of responsibility. But as we grew from sort of that one team to, I say, like the 14 teams there, we needed someone in charge. So that ultimately there's a sort of a building up of sort of the requirements of an organization. We had people who were supporting us in sort of like legal things, in procurement, in buying things, information assurance, and just sort of generally supporting the program. We had any programmer that will get to a sort of, it needs governance. It needs people to be steering it, not on the day-to-day, not on the week-to-week, but ultimately where is it going? And so there was a board. But it's important to note that none of this these layers of sort of control, if you like, were about sort of top-down, like sort of do this, do that. It was all about basically pushing the sort of the responsibility as far down as it could go, and only where decisions had to be made across those things, pushing it up. So we grew there sort of from, I say, a single bunch of people in a back room somewhere in government to a program of work going on that's still going on today of about 140 people at its peak across 14 teams. We're now an organization of about 250 people with multiple programs going on of different sizes. And one of the things that I think has been discussed a couple of times like the last few days was this concept of sort of portfolio management. Ultimately, the programs, again, are there to decide what they're going to do. But actually, as an organization, we need to be able to say yes or no to what it is we do. We only have so many people. We only have so much money. We only have so much time. We need to prioritize that. And so this concept of portfolio management came in to decide, well, what are the most important things across all of the things? And again, just enough sort of decision-making that the actual decisions can be made further down. And what's getting really interesting now is basically how we're working on scaling that across a multiple organization sort of, basically across multiple organizations. So governments everywhere, I mean, any organization that's sort of like hundreds of thousands of people probably isn't one thing, it's many things. So in the UK, we've got the Department for Work and Pensions, we've got the HMRC, the Treasury, we've got the Cabinet Office, we've got all these departments of different sizes. Some of those are 60, 70,000 people, so they're still sort of the size of a sort of a small bank. And what we're trying to do is basically embed the same sort of approaches, but also the same, like have some level of just enough sort of oversight in them. And we're writing a lot about sort of how we're thinking how about scaling agile across like sort of a large organization. And some things worked and some things didn't as we went on that journey. And some of them were simply to do with the rate that we did it. And some things I don't think were. So one of the things I think we got right for the most part was avoiding dependencies. Teams were not beholden to other teams for many things. They were able to basically just get on, make decisions, and feedback. And where that caused problems, we were able to change our minds. So we were able to add teams quicker than, like, was sensible necessarily, because teams could basically, they didn't need to have too much context about what the other teams were doing. And that was true of the teams and of a bunch of the software, and that sort of followed. But when there's many moving parts to that organization, it's sort of, you had to understand, well, where are the interfaces? Where are they? Like, who talks to who and how? And we went through several sort of iterations of trying to get information that was well understood within individual teams out to the rest of the program. So we ended up with sort of stand-up of stand-ups. But then it's you run this risk of sort of, well, who's the people who go to those things and how many people can they cater? I remember, I think at one point there was a stand-up of stand-ups which had like sort of 30 people attending it. And it just filled up an entire corridor. And it obviously wasn't working. And just sort of stripping it down to just the people who had to be part of that information sharing thing. And I touched a little bit, but it was things like sort of the interfaces between things, things like sort of the structures were as important for the people and for the software. And we very much stressed from the start, even when we were one team, that it wasn't about building sort of like functional silos. It was about having teams with the right skills on them to be able to do things end to end. So the only way to minimize those dependencies was basically for the teams to have people on them that could do all the things they needed to do. If you had to sort of go to another team to have someone do the design or have them do the research or have them sort of pull some numbers from a database somewhere to do some analytics or some reporting, you were going to build up these dependencies between the teams, and that would have slowed them down. So we went the other way and basically put the right people on the teams with the right skills. The actual sort of software architecture is actually for GovUK, although you sort of think, well, it's a big website. Actually, under the hood, it's many small pieces that drive that. In layers, but also even the front-end layers, there are many small bits. There is an application that literally just deals with calendars. And there's a few pages where basically a calendar is shown for example, public holidays. And we did this really early. Even when we were sort of a team of 14, we had many small parts. And people came in, and actually there was a barrier to entry there. People were like, this is crazy. There's more software components than there are people at this stage. And a few people sort of pushed against that. But as we then threw more people at the problem, the entire program of work, it made sense. It really came good. And someone who'd been sort of actually pretty opposed to he'd come in with just like, there's too many bits. And we said, well, we sort of think there are too many bits, but having many small parts is actually going to be, it's going to be the right decision. And he came up and said afterwards, like, actually, yeah, it was. It genuinely helped with us growing that team as quickly as we needed to do. And we made mistakes about the composition of those, and some of them weren't the right shape, or they didn't have the right interface to other things. But that comes to sort of another point, which was the ability to throw things away. If you have large things, and again, it's true of sort of like organizational entities, as it is with software, people become attached to them, or they become so ingrained in how things work that you can't get rid of them. And even changing them becomes difficult. Because we had loads of small parts, actually throwing things away was a lot easier. So we had an entire application that was dealing with it's basically sort of user plans, basically things that you would have to do in order to achieve something for government. And we threw it away completely, because actually someone else had built another tool that was more general, it was more generic, that allowed you to build things like that. And we were like, we don't need that anymore. And we just threw it away. And instead of people saying, oh, well, we invested time and money and we had to stay there, everyone was like, brilliant, yeah. We sort of talked about the theory of small things being cheap and disposable, but we hadn't done it. And then we realized we had done, so we were happy. But the only way that sort of all of that worked, and I think there's sort of anyone going through a sort of an agile sort of transformation, there has to be trust. There has to be trust all the way down. we were only able to sort of have the space to do any of this because we had the trust from ultimately the Minister for the Cabinet Office. And like, he might not trust me individually, but fundamentally he trusts my boss. And my boss trusts me. And basically, it's like just passing that down. There has to be trust in the organization as well, so for those different teams. So one of the things I said I'd want to talk about was just how critical sort of getting hold of the release process is in any sort of like an organization. I think this is, if you start an organization and you think, oh, there's loads of things that could do with changing, go after the release process first. It's not the easiest thing to go after, but it's gonna be the most impactful. So one of our design principles was iterate, then iterate again. Too many things basically just don't change enough. You can't make things better basically if you can only release software once every 6 months. Fundamentally, you will be driven by things that are out of date by the time you do them. You need to be able to run experiments. You need to be able to get things wrong in controllable ways. And in order to do that, you need to change software. So I have to include this tweet in basically all my presentations now. So this was a sort of couple of weeks after we launched. And there's so much good engineering thought and responsiveness behind GDS being able to release 88 updates in 8 days. And remember that this is again, like, if government can do it, this is in an audited environment. And over the first 6 months, we averaged about sort of 6 releases a working day. And that's code changes. That's not content. Content is separate. There's a content management system that deals with all of that. That's code changes. That's new features. That's bug fixes. That's configuration changes. And I think this is true. I think we changed less software on the day of launch than probably any day before or since. And what I mean by that is sort of, we were actually live with the site that we had before we were the canonical source of truth for the government online. And we were furiously working on that to get that ready, and we were chipping code all the time. And then on one day, basically, we actually, rather than switching something off, we switched something off. We switched off 2 of the websites, basically redirected something like 300,000 unique URLs to our site that had been there for a while. And suddenly we were real. And I think that first day we fixed a few things, but ultimately we were like, oh, it's real now. We're actually it. And then the next day we were like, oh, okay, yep, back to, like, it's now day 1. We've now launched. Now we're actually real. Now let's get on with the real work of see how people use it and making it better. And you can only change things that frequently if you have a deployment process that is automated. We don't have we don't have a deployment team. We have automated processes. We have a one-click deployment system. But probably more important nearly, or the next most important thing from sort of it being one click is that there's one place to deploy. We actually use Jenkins basically for orchestration in this case. And it's basically we use separate instances of Jenkins for doing these. Jenkins isn't ideal, but it works. It's very flexible. There'll be Go people who are getting scared, but it works. But having one place makes it, you avoid that problem of sort of like multiple people doing different things at the same time. We can enforce a load of things around just good practice. And we can make it auditable because we can control the access to this. And actually, we do sort of zero-click deploys for early parts of our pipeline. So we have different environments, and deploying to earlier ones will happen automatically where tests pass. So it's a sort of continuous deployment process, but with manual gates further up the line. Because actually, the interesting thing about like sort of putting this in place wasn't software, it wasn't actually automation. I think increasingly that should be a given. like there are tools that make writing sort of deployment systems today much easier than even a few years ago. So getting to that sort of like, well, I have one script that will deploy my application to everything, it is no longer a massive job. What was the really fun stuff with this in basically the government was applying basically suitable processes and access controls and other controls to that deployment. So now I can deploy, technically, this is really easy. I can click a button or I can not even click a button. It can just all happen automatically. But how do we know when we're deploying? Who has the ability to say when we're deploying? And how do we know that people aren't circumventing these processes? Engaging with that debate was the most important thing we did around sort of like building up trust and getting ownership of that release process. Because a large organization is probably sort of, well, we have change approval boards. We have basically sort of like, we have a bunch of controls in place to deal with releasing software. And when you say, well, I want to release software several times a day, they go, you can't. And the reason they will say that isn't necessarily because sort of they have an intrinsic problem with you doing that. It's that their current processes, they're like, well, we can't have a meeting every time you do that. And we have a meeting every time we change something, therefore you can't do it because we can't have a meeting. And it's like, well, what's the meeting there to do? Or what's the process there to do? Or what's this check there to do? Can we replace that with something that solves the same problem but differently? So talking about operations, talking about the sort of the processes around the technology that we're using was critical to basically to get people to realize that we weren't just people who wrote code, that we understood the problems that they were trying to solve. And some of that's language. And I don't know if, is there anyone in the room who recognizes this list of sort of transition planning and support, change management, asset and configuration management, release and deployment management? Is there anyone who recognizes it? There's a few hands go up. You can sort of read this as sort of, well, this is a lot of the cool, sexy sort of stuff that's coming out of that sort of DevOps communities, like configuration management and sort of release automation tools. This is the sort of thing that we're finding new ways of doing. But actually, the language is ITIL. ITIL is basically an IT service management framework. It's the type of thing that large organizations have used to basically just standardize processes. And it's like, well, so they've been doing this for years. And they have processes around this, and they have words and terminology and language around this that we've stolen for and we've made tools around them. So the fundamentals we agree on, the definitions we can learn, and we can then say, well, you have a process that does this. We have automation, or we have these controls that achieve the same end goal. And talking about risk, so there'll be a bunch of people who are interested in, well, what risks am I introducing? And there'll be certifications and maybe parts of sort of audited processes again. And one of the things that is sort of, it's counterintuitive, but in lots of contexts, regularly being able to regularly change your software reduces risk. And where people have worked in organizations where they've released some software in a sort of very big bang sort of way, and it didn't work, and I've been there and like it's all gone horribly wrong and everyone just is depressed for weeks, you just think, oh, I don't want to do that again. And when it comes round to sort of changing something again, it's like, do you remember last time? It was horrible. And you're like, oh, well, actually, let's not do it as often, because I don't want to feel bad all the time. So we need to try harder. We need to do more. And so instead, and you push back on releasing changes. The problem is that means you do less of them. And one of the sort of ways of sort of pitching this to anyone, isn't to do with software. It's not to do with technology. It was that everyone understands practice. So when we basically launched the beta of GovUK, and we were rolling out some final changes, one of the sort of senior people came on and said, like, oh, so like your release is we're going to be public tomorrow. You're going to like launch it, and we're like, yeah. And he was like, will it work? Because he'd worked at a very large broadcaster in the UK and had sort of scars from releasing software. And I said, oh, wait a minute. And I checked. And I was like, well, so we've done it about 1,500 times. I think it works now. And he was like, oh, brilliant. Because fundamentally, him and anyone will understand, sort of like, if you do something a lot, you get good at it. Because you get out of all those teasing bits. If you're releasing software every 6 months or every 3 months, then how many years does it take you to get to having done it that often? If you're doing it every day, it's just something that you do. And as long as you've got space to do that and fail many times, ideally within like sort of, well, fail loads within a few weeks before it's a problem. Get all those kinks out, and you've then got something you can take forward. And selling that to people, which is counterintuitive, via sort of like, well, practice makes perfect. So one of the things that we adopted very early on in the project, and have then sort of gone even further with, was really sort of just infrastructure as code. I think people have probably seen sort of the whole sort of configuration management tooling sort of really sort of like evolve and mature over the last few years. So and Puppet and Chef, sort of in particular, but even with sort of the CF Engine stuff, the newer Ansible and Salt stuff. And ultimately, this is about taking parts of your infrastructure and describing them in code, and having that code being both a source of record, but also an executable that that can enforce that sort of like that pattern, those patterns onto actual infrastructure. So that's a bit of Puppet saying, well, there should Apache 2 should be installed and Apache should be running. Doing this and having, as well as sort of like the low-level stuff, the sort of systems administration stuff, having higher-level abstractions. So the nice thing that here is basically we've got a programming tool, and it's programming. We can reason about things, and we can factor things in a similar way that we can with any code. So whereas like sort of some of our developers might not care about the implementation of things. They might not care that, well, it's an Apache web server and it has to be running. That's pretty low level. They might care about the fact that, well, this specific application is running. And at the moment, it's a rack app. So it's Ruby. And it's available on this port. And basically, they've set up a health check for the load balancer. And that can go away and set up things across multiple machines. It can set up the load balancing. It can set up the proxies. It can set up the log aggregation. It hides that complexity, so you can reason about the apps, or you can dig deeper and reason about the actual implementation of that. But it's important that it wasn't just it's broader than just that configuration. It's broader than just sort of like the things that are happening on this individual machine. So we've rolled a number of tools around sort of actual virtual machines and defining those in code, defining the actual network interfaces, the virtual network interfaces in code, defining firewall rules in code, and basically having, again, these, they're in code, they're in source control. We've got high-level tests for sort of just able to run as smoke tests and as part of monitoring, again, in code. And that code is available to the development team, it's available to the operations team, and it's a shared resource. And the interesting thing about that wasn't the sort of, again, it wasn't the tech, it wasn't the tools, it wasn't how we did that. It was the fact that we were able to reuse basically processes that people were already happy with. So, as I say, like getting to that sort of release process that basically worked for the organization and worked for the development team and allowed us to move really quickly, required a bunch of people to sort of sit down and say, well, this is how we make sure that we're doing it right. These are the checks and balances that we have in place. And there could be things like sort of code review pairing, using version control and having like sort of assurances around the sort of sanctity of that source control. Having a release pipeline that sort of builds trust over a period of releases. Having access controls in place so like when someone goes to it, we know they've done so. Like only people who are allowed to see X can see that. We had to go through this for our source code, for our application code, for the changes we wanted to make really rapidly. Now, we could have had a completely parallel world where we did all of these processes for the network and for spinning up new virtual machines. But actually, by saying, well, everything's source code, everything we can make is source code, we were able to focus time on making those processes good and robust rather than coming up with more of them. And no one wants more processes. And one of the things that processors often do in sort of large organizations is they result in spreadsheets because someone has to keep data somewhere. And the problem there is basically there's probably someone's job it is to keep that up to date. And that's always going to be a problem. And so avoiding this sort of spreadsheets as a source of truth thing. But they exist in processes because people need a record. But we can build tools that can provide that, often in a more automated way. So one example was, ignoring the rest of the organization, the developers wanted to know what versions of applications were in production and where they were in different environments. And the organization the organization needs auditability of those deploys happening. And I think we started out here with a sort of spreadsheet, but actually quite quickly we're able to make tools like this, which basically just sort of tracks those deploys for the different applications. And integrates that with our single sign-on system, which we had processes around. So we were able to then just solve things by building tools. And again, that sort of that visibility, that ownership, that sort of reuse of processes. And we do similar things with the configuration management data. So the sort of CMDB, sort of configuration management database. This is something that like a large organization that sort of has processes in place like ITIL will have. And they will have a list of all the versions of everything that they're running. And they'll have that in a database somewhere. And a bunch of that will rely on manual audits and spreadsheets in some cases. And it's just like, well, you can't do that fast. It's error-prone anyway. You can't do that quickly. But actually, with tools, we can automate this and we can provide them with not only something better than they had, but something that's even more auditable than they had. So last but not least was just working in the open. We started this and really just never stopped. The people who were originally there were sort of, we were very transparent about what we were doing because no one told us we couldn't be. And one of our design principles was make things open, it makes them better. And it was interesting with that one because we believed it, but we ultimately had to do it to prove it. And a lot of that was about communication. So we've done a lot with sort of blogging. We've done a lot with sort of video casting of sort of like what's going on. And part of that has been because we're there to help transform how a very large organization works, but we're a very small number of people. And one of the problems there is that we could either be perceived as, well, they're just miles away and they're tiny and they're unreachable, so we'll just ignore what's going on. Or we can sort of be seen as the enemy, because there's a faceless group of people who get to do all the interesting, cool stuff, but we're over here doing the real work. By being open, we were able to say to ourselves, well, that's not the case. We are people. We're sort of thinking about a bunch of things. Come and say hi. And we're increasingly encouraging the rest of government to sort of be more open. So one of the things that now is part of GovUK is a blogging platform for the rest of government, just to try and move away from sort of like that sort of, well, press release mentality. It's much more like sort of about interesting and like sort of low-level content than it is about sort of the voice of government, if you like. We also have done a lot of our actual software development completely publicly. This blog post from one of my colleagues, James Stewart, was sort of coding in the open. A lot of our code is open source, but some of it's very specific to our needs, but it's still public. So a bunch of our publishing tools, so that sort of power the content management aspects of GovUK are public. A bunch of the sort of front-end applications that power the actual sort of the website views that you get are public. A bunch of our sort of development environment sort of tools internally that we've built to sort of help designers or help developers or help anyone basically run parts of the stack are public. We've got all sorts of utilities that we've built that that are small little things that help maybe an individual or a team. This was basically some testing tools for Puppet to basically ensure you've got the right syntax. Small things, but basically, and they're the types of things that any organization where you've got sort of 100 or more or thousands of developers will build all the time. But our default approach was simply to make them public. We've even got actual content, basically, again, pure, like the published version of that content is also public, but you can go in and see the actual changes, and we mirror a bunch of things onto GitHub in this case, and this is for one of the projects that actually where GDS, the organization I work for, owns this content, it's ours, and you can see us reasoning about changes to that content, to changes about that government advice online if you choose, and people have and do comment or send us pull requests on some of that content. One of the advantages we've got from basically being open, having those projects as open source is that there's an ecosystem of tools that are friends with open source. And Travis CI, the online content continuous integration system, we've got loads of our projects testing on there. And it just gives that visibility to people who might be interested in what's government doing. It removes that sort of, oh, they're the government, they're the man, and they're a large organization. Even some of our projects, and this isn't all of them, but some of the project backlogs are actually public. So people can see what's coming up, they can see the bugs that people are fixing. And I think sort of probably most interestingly, and we've got a couple of teams who are dedicated just to this, is being open about the performance of the systems and the services that government provides. So this goes wider than the things that we're responsible for. But we've done a lot of work with the things we are responsible for. So what I mean by performance data is actually a bunch of the analytics data for the government online is now public. So if someone wants to see, well, people are visiting this or this, people are interested in this or this, how much traffic does that website really get? How much does it cost per transaction on this service? We're trying to get that data out in the spirit of openness, because fundamentally the taxpayers in the UK are paying for this stuff. Them seeing its actual operation, we feel, just simply helps. More graphs. So you can see things like, in this case, it was sort of the sort of performance of basically applying for a tax disc for your car. And you can, well, how's it actually doing? Are people satisfied with it? How much is it costing every time someone does it? And just to try and sort of, again, remove that sort of secretiveness, that sort of that leads to basically sort of things being bigger than they need to be. Some things are, we're very open and very public. Some things are open within the organization. So, there are parts of our source code that are not public. There are parts of our sort of the data that we have that isn't public. But we can still use the same techniques and controls and tools to make things open internally. So the office is filled with sort of with dashboards about how maybe teams are performing or what teams are doing or what's going on. Things like, well, what are people searching for? How busy is the site compared to yesterday? How is the support team doing with regards to tickets? As well as the traditional sort of developer sort of dashboards of sort of continuous integration or sort of operational graphs. Where we can, we do things that are as useful to sort of like the non-developer colleagues or the non-sort of systems administration colleagues. It's about higher level like sort of goals than it is about the sort of, well, are my tests passing? But what did we get from this? Why was, I think, even in hindsight, why was it worth some of the effort that we put in around this? Some of it was just genuinely goodwill. People like to see things happening. They like to understand that you are doing things. And by being open, it's very, very easy to share, to show people that you're doing things. If it's sort of, well, if one person asks, if you're in a sort of world where everything is closed, and someone asks you, you have to go through this process of, well, are they allowed to know? And if the answer is yes, maybe you send them something. But because that's an occasional event, you have to probably create something. So you have to decide whether you have to find out whether they're allowed to know something. You have to create a unique artifact, and you have to send it to them. Whereas actually, if the answer is, oh no, it's all public, just go have a look, not only does it make that challenge of people asking for things much easier, people who would never ask because they don't know something exists can find things, and that can lead to all sorts of interesting sort of just benefits. There's a validation aspect as well. So one of the things that happens is people see that, look at it, and tell us what they think about it. And that's feedback that you couldn't get if all you do is interact with people that already know about something. And even contributions. And we had, so one of the stories around, I mentioned the calendars application earlier, which basically shows bank holidays. We had an issue filed against that from someone outside our organization who checked the law, and he thinks that Scotland had a bank holiday on the wrong day. And that discussion is happening on an issue against some source code. And it's that because it's explicit. It's not that there's a big, long document somewhere that no one can talk to someone about, or someone can send an email to someone maybe, or phone someone up. There's source code that's explicit and that people can contribute to. And we have had sort of bug fixes or features from a community of people who are looking at our code. And I think that one of the obvious ones as well is hiring. By being open, we've increased the visibility of what we're doing. We're doing some interesting things, and they look interesting, and they're public, and people can see them. People are attracted to interesting things. And we've hired some people, not in the same way as I think the GitHub talk was talking about in terms of very active contributions to their code or tools that they were building, because our tools are a bit specific in most cases. But people have been attracted to the fact that they get to do open source development at work. So they were sort of like specific examples of things that we've seen, and I think a bunch of them do map to sort of other organizations. Especially if it's a large organization, it's going through a sort of transformation towards sort of adopting agile, adopting sort of modern software practices. But it's the first time I've used the word, sort of DevOps word. But DevOps is about the organization. It's not about it's not the code, it's not the tools, it's not developers. It's about the organization. It's about organizational processes. And the processes in an organization are based on what is possible. And I guess the missing word there was the processes in an organization are based on what is possible when they were created. And if you take one thing away, is that sort of what is possible is changing all the time. And sometimes that's fast and sometimes that's slow. And using those changes to basically reassess processes, actually, that's where sort of businesses can really sort of take a leap forward in their sort of agility. I say we're very public about a lot of the stuff we do, and one thing that's worth reading is the Government Service Design Manual, which has a lot of sort of this sort of stuff in there if it's something you're interested in. It even contains a definition of DevOps. So, thank you. Yep. How do you make sure rollback can be done if everything breaks on a deploy? Most things, rollback's nearly always a myth in that sort of state outside the control of that deploy probably changed. In most cases, we'd roll forward. But how we minimize that actually being a problem in reality is we're deploying small things. And so small things will hopefully have a small impact. And having an understanding of basically applications can fail. We design everything so basically it can fail. So what's the fallback? What's the fallback's fallback? So a bunch of the things we're dealing with are content problems. CDNs, caching servers, partial page failures, are actually, as long as it's not the core thing that you're there to do, actually a failure of that is probably fine. So it's basically challenging the assumption that failure is always, oh my God, it's a massive problem. It's more sort of, well, acknowledge that failures will happen and design systems such that they don't affect people. So we do some bits where we'll roll things. If things are sort of more critical, we can do things where we'll roll out to a sort of subset of things. We have a staging environment that is a literal mirror of the production environment that allows us to do a lot of sort of synthetic testing. But in reality, a lot of it is basically just anticipate failures. What version control system are you using, and how do you handle branching with multiple teams, feature switches, etc.? So again, because we have many projects, actually the number of people contributing at the same time to a given specific code base is small. Some of the teams, I mean, there are teams where there's sort of, I guess, 5 or 6 people sort of day in and out on the code with one application, and that one scares me because it's too many people at the same time. But most of the teams have many small applications, so it'll be, well, there's probably a pair working on a given application, or maybe 2 pairs working on that application at the same time. So you just don't run into all those problems. It's only a problem basically where you're changing service interfaces, because then you need collaboration between the teams, and you do that rarely enough for it to be noisy enough that communication happens. So we do have teams who are using feature switches. Again, this comes back to actually, the teams are very independent. So it's not everyone has feature switches. It's the teams that have decided and prioritized the work to do so because they feel like they have a need use feature switches. Under the hood, where it's Git for everything. So one of the things we are standardized on across the organization is using Git. A lot of the public stuff is on the public GitHub. We also run basically a private GitHub instance.
All right, I think we're at time. So thanks once again to Gareth. And if you have any questions, I'm sure he'll be around. Thank you.